You are not flying this plane. You never were. Something else has had its hands on the controls since before you can even remember, reacting to turbulence, adjusting course, deciding when to climb and when to dive, while you sat in the seat labeled pilot, believing the hands on the yoke were yours. And here's the part that should actually frighten you. Most people never find out who's really flying until the plane is already going down. They spend decades assuming it's them in control because it's their body in the seat, their name on the flight plan. But watch closely enough, under enough pressure, and you'll notice something else entirely. A set of reflexes older than your own memory, seizing the controls exactly when it matters most, making the call before you even knew a decision was being made. Some people never notice the switch at all. They just keep calling it their own choice, all the way to the ground. This isn't about willpower. It's about who's actually in the cockpit of your own mind, right now, while you listen to this, and the specific moment, later in this video, where you finally take the controls back for good. Let's actually open the cockpit door, because until you understand what's really been flying this plane, nothing you do next will change the course. Here's the uncomfortable truth about how your mind actually operates most of the time. The version of you that feels like you, the one weighing decisions, considering options, believing it's steering, is not the system actually running most of your life. That version is more like a passenger who occasionally gets handed the controls during calm weather, long enough to feel important, before something else quietly takes back over the moment real turbulence hits. That something else has a name, and it isn't mysterious once you understand it. Psychologists call it automaticity, the vast majority of your daily behavior running on pre-programmed patterns that require no conscious thought at all. You don't decide to flinch from a loud noise. You don't decide to feel your stomach drop when a certain tone of voice shows up in a conversation. Something else, installed long before you had any say in the matter, already decided how you'd respond, and it's been flying that particular route on autopilot ever since. Hill spent his career studying exactly this system, decades before science had a name for it. What he called the subconscious mind functions less like a servant waiting for instructions and more like an engine already running, executing whatever program it was given, regardless of whether that program still serves the person depending on it. He was clear that most people never seize control of this system in their entire lives. They simply ride along, mistaking the autopilot's decisions for their own, the way a passenger might glance at the instrument panel and assume, because they're sitting in the front, that they're the one actually flying. Think about what happens the instant real pressure hits, a hard conversation about money, a decision that could change the next decade of your life, a moment where everything in you wants to say yes, but something older and faster says no first. In that instant, you're not weighing pros and cons the way you'd like to believe. Autopilot has already engaged. The decision that feels like careful, conscious deliberation is very often just a story your conscious mind tells afterward, explaining a choice the autopilot already made half a second earlier. This isn't a flaw in the design. It's actually the entire reason the design exists. A mind that consciously deliberated over every single decision, every single day, would burn out within hours. You'd never survive walking down a crowded street if you had to consciously calculate every step, every glance, every reflex. Autopilot exists because conscious thought is slow, expensive, and limited, while automatic pattern running is fast, cheap, and nearly limitless. The system isn't broken. It's doing exactly what it was built to do. Here's where it becomes dangerous, though, and this is the part almost nobody stops to examine. Autopilot doesn't distinguish between a pattern that serves you and a pattern that's quietly sabotaging you. It doesn't check whether the flight path it learned years ago still leads somewhere you actually want to go. It simply keeps flying the route it was taught, over and over, with total confidence, regardless of whether that route was ever actually chosen by the person now living with the consequences of it. Picture a woman who says yes to nearly every invitation she receives, every favor asked of her, Every obligation handed her way, even when some part of her is quietly screaming to say no. She'll tell you, honestly, that she decided it was easier to just agree. She believes this completely, but nothing was decided in that moment. A route programmed decades ago, maybe from being praised only when she was agreeable, maybe from one specific memory of conflict that taught her saying no wasn't safe, simply engaged, exactly the way it's engaged 1,000 times before, and handed her a conclusion dressed up as a choice. This is why simply trying harder rarely works to fix this kind of pattern. You cannot outmuscle an autopilot system through willpower alone, because willpower operates through the slow, conscious system, the passenger seat, while autopilot operates through a completely different, much faster channel. By the time your conscious mind even registers that a decision needs to be made, autopilot has often already made it. This is precisely why so many people can understand, intellectually, exactly what they should do differently and still watch themselves do the same old thing anyway, feeling almost like a spectator to their own behavior. So if conscious effort alone can't override a system this fast, this deeply installed, the real question becomes something far more specific than how do I try harder? It becomes this: how does someone actually gain access to the controls of a system that was never designed to hand them over easily in the first place? Here's where most self-help advice gets this exactly backwards, and it's worth naming clearly before we go any further. You cannot fight autopilot in real time. By the time you're in the moment, pressure already rising, decision already forming, the passenger seat simply doesn't have the processing speed to win that fight. Trying to consciously override autopilot mid-flight is like trying to grab the controls back during severe turbulence, with no training, no warning, and half the instruments already reading data you don't know how to interpret. So if the fight can't happen in the moment, when does it actually happen? This is the part that changes everything once you understand it. The fight happens before the flight even takes off, not during turbulence, in the hangar, on the ground, in complete calm, long before pressure ever enters the picture. Hill never suggested fighting a limiting thought the instant it appeared. He insisted on something almost the opposite, deliberately, repeatedly rehearsing a new response during calm moments, specifically so that response would already be installed and waiting by the time pressure arrived, rather than being invented from scratch under fire. He understood, without the modern vocabulary for it, that you cannot install new software mid-flight. You install it on the ground, while the engine is off, so it's simply running by the time the plane needs it. Think about how flight simulators actually work, and why every commercial pilot spends hundreds of hours in one before ever touching a real cockpit under real pressure. Nobody hands a new pilot the controls during an actual engine failure and expects a calm, correct response purely from instinct. The correct response gets built beforehand, deliberately, in a simulator, run over and over in complete safety, specifically so that when the real emergency eventually happens, the pilot's hands already know exactly what to do before the conscious mind even finishes registering the danger. The response isn't discovered in the crisis. It's installed long before the crisis, through repetition specific enough to survive contact with real pressure. This is exactly what rehearsing a new mental response has to look like to actually compete with autopilot. Not a vague intention to handle things better next time. A detailed rehearsal, repeated in calm conditions, of exactly what you want to think, say, and do the next time a particular kind of pressure shows up. Rehearsed with enough repetition and enough real feeling attached to it that it becomes something closer to muscle memory than to a nice idea you had once. Picture someone rehearsing a calmer response to financial stress, someone who spent years spiraling the instant an unexpected bill arrives, checking the account obsessively, catastrophizing about worst-case scenarios that never actually happen, losing sleep over amounts that, a week later, turn out to have been manageable all along. Trying to simply stay calm, In the actual moment the bill arrives, almost never works, because autopilot has already engaged by the time the panic starts. But rehearsing in advance, on an ordinary evening with nothing actually wrong, picturing the exact moment an unexpected charge shows up and deliberately walking through a steadier response, complete with the specific breath, the specific sentence, the specific decision to wait 24 hours before reacting, builds something autopilot eventually has to compete with. Not instead of the old panic response, genuinely alongside it, until the new one finally becomes fast enough to win. Here's why this distinction matters more than almost anything else in this video. Most people who fail at changing a pattern didn't fail because the principle was wrong. They failed because they only ever tried to apply the new response in the moment of crisis, exhausted every single time, wondering why willpower alone never seemed to hold. The people who actually succeed at this are, almost without exception, doing their real work somewhere else entirely, in the quiet, unremarkable hours when nothing is testing them at all, building a second flight path detailed and rehearsed enough to eventually outcompete the one that's been running the show for years. There's a specific reason this rehearsal has to happen away from pressure and not during it, and it's worth being precise about the mechanism instead of simply asserting it. Under real stress, your brain's resources shift almost entirely toward the fast, automatic system, cortisol rising, blood flow redirecting away from the slower, deliberate parts of your mind, exactly the parts responsible for learning something new. Trying to install a new pattern during a crisis is like trying to write new code on a computer that's already redirected all its power toward emergency functions. The bandwidth simply isn't there. Calm isn't just more pleasant for rehearsal. It's the only condition under which rehearsal actually works. So the real skill isn't becoming someone who handles pressure perfectly the first time it shows up. It's becoming someone who's already run the simulation enough times, in complete calm, that pressure simply activates a response that's already been built, instead of forcing you to invent one, under fire, with no training and no time. So let's get specific about what actually goes into a rehearsal detailed enough to compete with autopilot. Because vague rehearsal fails for the exact same reason vague intention always fails. It doesn't give the system anything concrete enough to actually run. Here's the first mistake almost everyone makes when they try this. They rehearse the outcome instead of the process. They picture themselves being confident or staying calm, a kind of hazy, general feeling with no actual sequence attached to it. This doesn't work, and there's a specific reason why. Autopilot doesn't run on feelings. It runs on sequences, specific triggers followed by specific responses, wired together through repetition until the sequence fires automatically. Rehearsing a vague feeling gives the system nothing to actually wire. It's like trying to program a flight path by describing the destination in beautiful language, without ever entering the actual coordinates. A real rehearsal has to include the trigger itself, rehearsed in specific detail, not skipped past. This is where people flinch, because it's uncomfortable to deliberately picture the exact moment things go wrong. But skipping the trigger is precisely why so many rehearsed responses fail on contact with the real thing. The mind has practiced the calm response in isolation, disconnected from the actual moment that's supposed to activate it. The way a pilot who only practices smooth landings, never actual engine failures, freezes the first time a real warning light appears, because the trigger itself was never part of the simulation. Think about what a complete rehearsal actually requires, structurally. First, the specific trigger, pictured in enough detail that it generates a real, if smaller, version of the actual physical reaction. The phone buzzing with an unexpected number, the tightness starting in your chest before you've even answered it. Second, the old automatic response, briefly acknowledged rather than ignored, noticing the pull toward panic, toward the old script, without pretending it isn't there. Third, and this is the part almost everyone skips, a specific, deliberate interruption, not "I stay calm," but something concrete enough to actually execute. One slow breath, a specific sentence said internally, a specific physical action like setting the phone down before responding. Fourth, the new response, rehearsed all the way through to completion, not just the first few seconds of it. Picture someone rehearsing a new response to a family member who reliably brings up an old financial mistake at every gathering, needling at something that used to derail him completely for days afterward. The old pattern is automatic, a flash of shame, a defensive reply, hours of replaying the exchange afterward, unable to let it go. Rehearsing, "I won't let it bother me," changes nothing because it's vague, outcome-focused, disconnected from the actual trigger. A real rehearsal looks different. He pictures the specific comment, in the specific tone it's usually delivered in. He notices, honestly, the old flash of shame rising. He rehearses one deliberate interruption, a slow exhale, a specific internal sentence. That was years ago, and it doesn't define what I'm building now. Then he rehearses the new response all the way through, a calm, brief reply, followed by simply continuing the conversation, rather than the old spiral of replaying that used to consume the rest of his evening. Run enough times, in calm moments with nothing actually at stake, this entire sequence starts to compete directly with the old one, on the old one's own turf, using the old one's own trigger. This is why specificity matters more than people initially assume. A rehearsal is only as strong as its weakest, vaguest component. Skip the trigger, and the response never activates when it's actually needed. Skip the interruption, and the new response has no bridge connecting it to the old moment. Rehearse only the ending, and you've built a beautiful conclusion with no way to actually reach it under real conditions. There's something worth understanding about why this works at the level it does, beyond simple habit formation. Every time you run this rehearsal with real, if modest, emotional engagement, not bored recitation, but genuine attention to the trigger and the feeling it produces, you're laying down the same kind of groundwork that real experience lays down, at a smaller scale. This is the same principle a musician relies on when learning a difficult passage away from the instrument, running the exact fingering and timing in their mind until the hands, when they finally return to the keys, already seem to know the way. Your mind, in this narrow but important sense, doesn't fully distinguish between a vividly rehearsed sequence and one that actually happened. Both leave a trace. Both build the beginning of a path. Before we go any further, if you can already picture the specific trigger that's been running your own outdated sequence for longer than you'd like to admit, write the word success in the comments below. Not as decoration, as a signal that you're done letting an old, unrehearsed reflex make decisions on your behalf, and ready to start building a sequence that actually belongs to you. The people who take this small, specific step are the ones who go home and actually run the simulation tonight, instead of simply nodding along and forgetting all of this by morning. Because there's still one piece of this missing, and it's the piece that determines whether the new sequence, once built, actually holds, or quietly gets overridden the very first time it meets real, unrehearsed pressure. Here's the piece almost everyone leaves out, and it's the exact reason a rehearsal can be technically correct in every detail and still fail the moment it meets real life. A sequence without emotional weight behind it is just words in the right order. It's a flight plan filed but never actually flown. Think back to what autopilot actually is. It isn't simply a repeated sequence. It's a repeated sequence that was originally installed under real emotional intensity. The reason an old fear response fires so fast, so reliably, isn't just that it's been repeated many times. It's that it was first wired in during a moment that actually mattered, emotionally, to the person living it. A single humiliating memory from childhood can outweigh years of calm, rational adult experience, precisely because the emotional charge attached to it gave it priority installation. Your mind doesn't rank memories by how many times they occurred. It ranks them by how much they mattered when they happened. This is why a flat, mechanical rehearsal, going through the 4 steps like a checklist, feeling nothing in particular while you do it, competes poorly against an old pattern that was installed with real feeling behind it. You're bringing a whisper to compete against something that was originally shouted. Every aircraft carries a black box, recording every flight, storing data the pilot can pull from later, not hypothetical scenarios, but what actually happened, proof the plane handled real conditions before. You already have one of these, even if you've never opened it. It's not filled with fear. It's filled with moments where you actually stayed steady, actually got through something hard, actually flew clean through weather you didn't think you'd survive. Most people never pull footage from their own black box when rehearsing a new response. They rehearse a hopeful guess instead, disconnected from anything that's ever actually happened to them, which is precisely why the rehearsal ends up sounding thin next to a pattern installed on real, remembered intensity. Hill was specific that thought repeated without real feeling attached to it barely registers as instruction to the subconscious at all, a claim modern psychology has since confirmed in its own language, with emotional intensity standing out as one of the strongest predictors of how deeply something gets encoded into memory. A rehearsal run with genuine feeling isn't just more pleasant to do. It's mechanically more likely to actually compete with a pattern that was installed the exact same way. So the practical move is this: before rehearsing the new sequence, pull the actual footage. Find one specific, real memory of steadiness, however small it seemed at the time, and let it play again in enough detail to feel it, not just remember it happened. Picture someone rehearsing a calmer response to conflict. Someone who spent years going silent and resentful the instant a disagreement starts, replaying the argument for days afterward instead of resolving anything in the moment. Simply picturing a calm response, flatly, changes very little. But if she first pulls the memory of the one time she actually stayed level-headed through something genuinely hard, a brutal week at work she got through without losing her composure once, and lets that memory play in real detail before attaching it to the new sequence, something shifts. She's no longer rehearsing a hopeful guess about a stranger's behavior. She's flying with data from her own black box, not an invented forecast. This also explains something that confuses a lot of people who've tried affirmations or visualization before and quietly given up on them. They weren't wrong that repetition works. They were missing the footage that makes repetition actually count as instruction instead of noise. Reciting a new sequence while thinking about something else entirely produces almost nothing measurable, no matter how many times it's repeated. The same sequence, rehearsed with real footage and real attention behind it, 10 or 15 times, can begin to compete with a pattern that took years to install, because emotional weight, not repetition count alone, is the actual currency this system runs on. Here's what changes once you understand this fully. The goal was never to rehearse until you technically repeated something enough times to hit some arbitrary number. The goal is to rehearse until the new sequence carries real weight, pulled from real footage, felt in real detail, specific enough to finally compete with the old pattern on equal terms, instead of showing up to the fight already outmatched before it began. And once a sequence has actually been built this way, something else has to happen next that almost nobody prepares for. Because installing a new flight path is one thing. Watching the old one refuse to simply hand over the controls without a fight is an entirely different experience, and it's coming for you sooner than you'd expect. Here's what almost nobody expects the first time a new sequence actually starts winning. The old autopilot doesn't quietly step aside. It resists, and for a stretch, it resists harder than it ever has before. This isn't a metaphor stretched for effect. It's a real, observable pattern in how deeply wired systems respond to being challenged. The first few times your rehearsed sequence actually beats the old reflex in a real moment, something in you doesn't relax. It tightens. The old fear doesn't fade quietly into the background. It gets louder, more urgent, throwing every warning light it has at you, as if some part of your mind has just noticed, for the first time in years, that its hands are actually being pried off the controls. Think about what happens in an aircraft when a pilot disengages autopilot manually after it's been flying the plane for hours. The system doesn't simply switch off without protest. Alarms sound. Warning indicators light up across the panel. The aircraft, in its own mechanical way, is registering that manual control has been reasserted, and it responds by making that transition felt, loudly, rather than quietly stepping aside. This isn't malfunction. It's exactly what the system is built to do. The instant control changes hands. Your own old patterns behave almost identically. The louder the alarms, the more real the transition actually is. Persistence, in Hill's own framing, was never a smooth ascent toward a goal. It was something closer to holding the controls steady while the instruments are still screaming at you, expecting resistance to spike right before it finally breaks, rather than reading a spike in resistance as proof you've grabbed the wrong controls entirely. Picture the very first time this actually gets tested, not weeks in, but on day one. Someone runs their new rehearsed sequence for the first time in a real moment. The exact trigger they practiced for finally shows up, unscheduled, in the middle of an ordinary day. The new response fires, a little clumsy, but it fires. And instead of relief, something unexpected follows within the hour. A wave of anxiety, far sharper than the original trigger ever produced on its own. Almost as if the old system is retaliating for having been overridden even once. This is the part nobody warns you about. The first successful override isn't usually followed by quiet. It's often followed by the loudest alarm yet, precisely because the old system has just received undeniable proof that it can, in fact, be overridden, and it responds the only way it knows how, by escalating. This is the exact point where most people quietly hand the controls back, mistaking that escalation for evidence the new sequence made things worse instead of what it actually is. The old system's last, desperate attempt to reassert a route it can feel losing its exclusivity. Let go here, and the old pattern gets to interpret the moment as proof it was right to take back over. Hold the yoke steady through it, even shaken, even without full confidence, and something changes. The next override costs less. The alarm after that, less still. The system isn't defeated in one motion. It's worn down, override by override, each one slightly quieter than the alarm before it. There's a specific kind of steadiness this calls for, and it has nothing to do with feeling brave. You don't need confidence to keep your hands on the controls during this stretch. You need willingness to fly through noise slightly longer than the old system expects you to tolerate, because that alone, more than any technique in this video, is what actually determines whether the new sequence survives contact with real pressure or gets abandoned the first time it gets loud. Here's why this particular stretch connects directly back to everything this video opened with. This is precisely the moment most people quietly return the controls to autopilot, mistaking the system's loudest defense for evidence that nothing is actually changing. And every time someone lets go here, they're not simply failing to build the new route. They're reinforcing the old one's authority over the exact turbulence that was supposed to prove it could finally be challenged. So the real question isn't whether the alarms will sound once you actually start flying differently. They will, reliably, almost exactly on schedule, often right after the very first small win. The real question is whether you'll recognize them correctly when they come, as the sound of an old system finally losing its grip, not as a warning that you've made a mistake. There's a second kind of resistance worth naming here, separate from the internal alarms we just talked about, because this one doesn't come from inside the cockpit at all. It comes from the tower. Think about how air traffic control actually works. A pilot doesn't fly in isolation. Every course correction gets communicated, tracked, expected by people on the ground who've built their own plans around the flight path you've always followed. Change that path mid-flight, even for good reason, even when it's clearly the right call, and the tower notices immediately. Sometimes they adjust smoothly. Sometimes they push back, confused, asking you to explain a deviation they weren't expecting and aren't sure they trust yet. The people in your life function as your own version of that tower. For years, they've built their expectations, their routines, their own sense of who you are, around the flight path you've always run. Not maliciously, practically. A brother who's always known you as the cautious one has built a version of every family conversation around that caution. A friend who's always been able to predict exactly how you'll respond to conflict has structured entire dynamics around that predictability. When your flight path actually starts changing, it isn't just your own internal alarms that go off. Theirs do too, even if they'd never describe it that way. This is precisely why real change sometimes gets met with a resistance that feels confusing to receive, especially from people who claim, honestly, to want good things for you. It rarely comes from anyone actively rooting against you. It comes from a tower that built its own operations around a route you're no longer flying, responding the only way any control system responds to unexpected deviation, with questions, with caution, sometimes with a kind of quiet pressure to just get back on the route everyone already knows how to work with. Picture a man who spent a decade talking himself out of expanding a business he's genuinely good at running, always deferring to a business partner who's grown used to being the one who makes the bigger calls. He finally runs his new sequence, a rehearsed, deliberate way of presenting an expansion plan he stopped himself from mentioning a dozen times before. The first time he actually says it out loud, clearly, without the usual hedging, the reaction isn't celebration. It's a long pause, followed by something like, "Since when do you push for things like this?" Nothing about that reaction means he's made the wrong call. It means the tower is recalibrating in real time, and recalibration, for anyone, rarely looks graceful in the moment it's happening. Here's the distinction that actually matters, and it isn't between people who support your growth and people who don't. Almost nobody in your life consciously wants you flying a worse route. The distinction is between people whose own plans can absorb your correction, adjusting their expectations without much friction, and people whose plans were quietly depending on you never changing course at all. The first group recalibrates and moves on, sometimes even more connected to you than before. The second group experiences your correction as a genuine disruption to something they'd built, and that disruption is real, even if it was never something you were responsible for preventing. There's a specific kind of resolve this requires, distinct from the resolve it takes to override autopilot in the first place. It's the willingness to keep flying the new route even while a voice from the tower is questioning it, without immediately reverting just to make the questioning stop. Their confusion is real. It is not, however, evidence that you've plotted the wrong course, and treating it as evidence is one of the fastest ways to hand the controls right back to the very system you've been working this hard to override. If you've stayed with me until this point in the video, it's because you're committed to creating a life of abundance and success. That's why I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Every video here is designed to help you develop the mindset that attracts wealth, prosperity, and new opportunities every single day. Because there's one more layer to this worth understanding before we reach the end. What actually happens once the alarms finally quiet down, the tower finally recalibrates, and the new route simply becomes the one you fly without having to think about it at all. Here's what that final stretch actually looks like, and it's smaller, quieter, and far less dramatic than most people expect after everything it took to get here. The alarms don't stop all at once. They stop the way any repeated signal eventually stops, not through a single dramatic silence, but through gradually decreasing volume, override after override, until one day you notice, almost by accident, that the warning didn't fire at all. Not because you consciously suppressed it, because the old system finally stopped generating it in that particular situation, having run out of reasons to keep insisting the new route was a mistake. This is the part almost nobody describes accurately, because they're expecting a finish line, a single moment where the old autopilot formally surrenders and hands over the controls with some kind of ceremony. That moment doesn't come. What comes instead is something closer to a gradual transfer of authority, so gradual that by the time it's actually complete, you often can't identify the exact day it happened. You simply notice, one ordinary afternoon, that the new sequence fired first, without the old one even attempting to compete, and you have to think back to realize how unusual that would have seemed 6 months earlier. Think about what it actually means for a new flight path to become the default one, rather than the effortful alternative you have to consciously choose every single time. In the beginning, running the new sequence takes real, deliberate effort. You have to notice the trigger, consciously execute the interruption, consciously walk through the new response, every single time, feeling the friction of choosing something that doesn't yet come naturally. But every successful run doesn't just solve that one moment. It adds weight to the new route, the same way every flight along a specific course reinforces that course as the standard one, until eventually it's not the alternative anymore. It's simply the route the system defaults to, without anyone needing to actively choose it. Hill described a stage where a deliberately cultivated new habit of thought stops requiring conscious effort altogether and begins operating with the same automaticity the old pattern once held exclusively. A transition he considered the actual endpoint of this kind of work, not the rehearsal itself. Strip away the language of his era, and he was describing precisely what happens once a new sequence has been run enough times to earn the same automatic status the old one used to hold. Picture someone 8 months into this work, long past the loudest alarms, long past the tower's most confused pushback. An old trigger shows up, the exact kind of moment that used to send them spiraling without fail, and something unremarkable happens instead. The new response simply fires. No internal negotiation. No conscious recall of the 4 steps. It just happens, the way the old panic used to just happen, except now it's steadiness doing the automatic work instead of fear. They might not even register it as a victory in the moment. It'll just feel like a landing that didn't require any particular skill to notice, which is, in the end, exactly what mastery of this actually looks like from the inside. Remarkably unremarkable, precisely because the fight is finally over. This is where it becomes important to reframe something people often misunderstand about what they're actually working toward this entire time. The goal was never to become someone who no longer feels fear, no longer feels the pull of an old pattern, no longer experiences turbulence at all. That version of a person doesn't exist, and chasing it sets you up for a strange kind of disappointment even after real change has taken hold. The actual goal, the one this entire video has been building toward, is becoming someone whose default response to turbulence is no longer automatic surrender to the old pattern, but automatic execution of a new one, built deliberately, rehearsed specifically, and finally installed deeply enough to run without a fight. There's a specific kind of confidence available once this transition genuinely completes, and it's quieter than people expect it to be. It isn't the loud, performative kind. It's closer to what an experienced pilot feels boarding a familiar aircraft. Not because nothing could ever go wrong, but because they trust, specifically and correctly, that if something does go wrong, they already know exactly what to do, because they've already run the sequence enough times for it to be real. That specific, earned trust, not blind optimism, not forced positivity, is what actually sits underneath someone who has genuinely taken back the controls of their own mind. And once you're flying from that place, something becomes available that wasn't available before. Not just the ability to handle turbulence well, but the ability to actually choose a destination worth flying toward in the first place, instead of simply reacting to whatever weather shows up along the way. Here's something worth confronting directly, because everything this video has described up to this point solves a real problem. but it doesn't solve the problem that actually matters most if it's applied without direction. You can become extraordinarily skilled at overriding autopilot and still spend that skill flying toward nowhere in particular. This is where a lot of people quietly stall out, even after doing genuinely hard, effective work on themselves. They learn to interrupt the old panic. They learn to run a calmer sequence instead of the old one. And then, somewhere in the relief of no longer being hijacked by fear, they never actually ask the next question. Steady toward what, exactly? A pilot who's mastered manual control but never filed a flight plan isn't free. They're simply drifting competently, capable of handling whatever weather shows up, but with no particular reason to be flying in one direction over another. Think about what actually distinguishes a person who's done this work with real purpose from someone who's done the same internal work without ever pointing it anywhere specific. Both of them, under pressure, might genuinely stay calm, avoid the old spiral, execute a steadier response than they would have a year earlier. But one of them is steady in service of something concrete, a specific number, a specific version of their life 5 years from now, a specific conversation they're finally capable of having because the old panic no longer runs the show. The other is simply calmer, generally, without that calm actually being aimed at anything. The first person's skill compounds into something. The second person's skill just makes the drifting more comfortable. Hill treated self-mastery as necessary but incomplete on its own, a precondition, not a destination. What actually organizes all that hard-won control, in his framing, is a definite purpose, a specific target clear enough to give discipline somewhere to fly toward. Without it, even a mind that's genuinely stopped panicking tends to drift, however capably, rather than arrive anywhere in particular. This is precisely why the video opened the way it did, with the image of a plane rather than simply a mind. A plane without a flight plan doesn't crash immediately. It might fly beautifully for hours, handling turbulence with real skill, staying level, staying controlled. But eventually, fuel runs out, and a beautifully piloted aircraft with no destination lands nowhere in particular, or doesn't land safely at all, precisely because skill was never the missing ingredient. Direction was. Picture someone who's done the work this entire video has walked through, rehearsed the sequences, survived the alarms, weathered the tower's confusion, and finally reached that quiet, earned steadiness under pressure. If you asked them, honestly, where all that steadiness is actually flying them toward, and the honest answer is, I'm not sure, I just know I don't panic anymore, something crucial is still missing. The turbulence has been handled. The destination was never chosen. This is the question worth sitting with now, the same kind of honest confrontation this video has asked of you before. Not, can I control my reactions? You're already learning that, and you'll keep getting better at it the more you rehearse. The harder question is this: once you're no longer being hijacked by old panic every time pressure shows up, what do you actually want to do with a mind that's finally flying straight? Because a controlled mind pointed at nothing in particular is simply a more comfortable version of being lost, and comfortable drifting has its own way of feeling, for a while, like enough. So let's actually answer that question, because leaving it hanging would betray everything this video has built towards so far. What does it actually mean to file a real flight plan, instead of simply flying well without one? Here's where most people get this wrong in a subtle but costly way. They confuse a destination with a wish. I want to be financially free sounds like a flight plan. It isn't one. It's a direction with no coordinates, which means it can't actually organize anything. Not your fuel, not your route, not the specific decisions you'll need to make along the way. A real destination has an address. It has a number attached to it, a date, a concrete picture specific enough that your mind can actually orient toward it instead of vaguely gesturing in its general direction. Think about the difference between telling a pilot, fly somewhere nice, and handing them exact coordinates, an altitude, a runway number. The first instruction is technically words. The second is something an aircraft can actually be flown toward, adjusted for, corrected against when wind pushes it slightly off course. Your own mind needs the same specificity to organize the discipline you've just spent this entire video building. Vague wanting gives your hard-won control nothing concrete to aim at, which means, even with perfect technique, you end up circling instead of arriving. Definiteness of purpose sat at the foundation of nearly everything else Hill ever taught, not as a warm-up exercise before the real work began, but as the organizing force that decided whether every other principle actually amounted to anything. A disciplined mind with a vague goal, in his observation, consistently underperformed an ordinary mind with a sharply defined one. Not because discipline doesn't matter, but because discipline without a specific target simply produces very efficient drifting. Consider two flights logged by the exact same pilot, using the exact same training, the exact same rehearsed sequences for handling turbulence. One flight has coordinates entered before takeoff, a precise destination, a runway, and arrival time. The other takes off with the engine running perfectly, the pilot fully capable, but no coordinates entered at all. Both flights might handle a storm along the way with identical skill. Only one of them actually lands somewhere. The other simply stays airborne, competently, for as long as the fuel allows, before coming down wherever the fuel happens to run out. Not because the piloting was worse, but because nothing was ever pointed anywhere specific to begin with. Here's the part worth being honest about, because it explains why so many people avoid this specific step even after doing everything else correctly. Naming an exact destination is more exposing than staying vague. Vague wanting can never really be disappointed because it never actually committed to anything specific enough to fail at. The moment you name the real number, the real date, the real conversation you're actually flying toward, you've given yourself something that can be missed, and that exposure, uncomfortable as it is precisely what makes the goal real enough to organize your discipline around in the first place. This is worth sitting with directly, the same honest way this video has asked you to sit with everything else. Not, do I want more success? Which is really just another way of flying somewhere nice. What is the actual coordinate? What is the specific number, the specific date, the specific version of an ordinary afternoon 5 years from now that you're willing to name clearly enough that missing it would actually mean something? Because everything this video has given you, the mechanism, the rehearsal, the willingness to hold steady through the alarms, was never meant to make you calmer for its own sake. It was meant to finally give you a mind capable of flying somewhere specific the moment you're honest enough to name exactly where that is. There's one final piece of this worth naming, because it's the piece that determines whether the coordinate you just named actually gets flown toward or quietly joins the long list of destinations people mean to reach and never actually enter into the system. Here's what tends to happen right after someone finally names their real coordinate, and it's worth preparing for honestly instead of pretending it won't happen to you. The moment a destination becomes specific enough to be real, a new kind of resistance shows up, quieter than the alarms, subtler than the tower's confusion, and for that exact reason, more dangerous than either. It doesn't sound like fear. It sounds like practicality. Maybe I should wait until things are more stable. Maybe this isn't quite the right season to commit to something this specific. The old system, having lost the fight over control, makes one final attempt at a different kind of sabotage. Not panic this time, but postponement, dressed up as wisdom. Think about what postponement actually does to a flight plan that's already been filed. It doesn't cancel the destination outright. That would be too obvious, too easy to catch. It simply keeps pushing the departure time, quietly, one delay at a time, until the coordinates are technically still entered but the plane never actually leaves the runway. Picture someone who names their exact coordinate tonight. A specific number, a specific date, a specific version of their life they can finally describe in detail instead of vague terms. For the first few hours, it feels real, almost urgent. Then a familiar thought arrives. calm, and reasonable sounding. I'll start properly once next week settles down. Next week arrives, and the same sentence quietly reappears, slightly rephrased, attached to a new reasonable sounding reason. Nothing about this feels like giving up. It never does. That's precisely what makes it effective. A destination you've named, but never actually flown toward, isn't meaningfully different from one you never named at all. The naming was necessary. It was never sufficient on its own. This is why the actual test of everything you've learned in this video isn't a single dramatic moment of courage. It's what happens in the next few days, while resistance to this specific coordinate is still soft, before postponement has a chance to harden into another comfortable, indefinite delay. A definite purpose, in Hill's own framing, only stays alive when it's followed quickly by some form of action, however small, because a plan left sitting too long without a first concrete step tends to lose its charge, the same way anything loses momentum the longer it sits untouched. You don't need the entire journey plan before you take off. You need one small, specific action, taken soon enough that the coordinate stays real instead of drifting back into the comfortable fog of someday. Not the whole flight. Just enough thrust to actually leave the ground, while everything you've built in the last several minutes is still fresh enough to carry you through the first real turbulence that's waiting exactly where this video told you it would be. This is where the mechanism and the mission finally meet. The sequence you rehearsed, the alarms you've learned to expect, the tower you now know how to fly through without immediately turning back. None of it was ever separate from the coordinate you just named. It's the exact system that gets you there. And the only thing standing between understanding that system and actually using it is whether you let this feeling fade into another year of near misses, or whether you treat tonight as the moment the engine actually starts. Let's go back to the very first thing I told you. You are not flying this plane. You never were. You know now exactly what that meant. Something installed long before you had any say in it had been sitting in the cockpit of your own mind, running a route you never consciously chose, mistaking its decisions for yours every single time pressure showed up. A flinch built from a memory you've forgotten. A hesitation inherited from someone who never meant to hand it to you, but did anyway. Autopilot, doing exactly what it was built to do, with absolutely no way of knowing whether the route it learned years ago still leads anywhere you actually want to go. You also know, now, exactly what it takes to change that. Not fighting the controls mid-flight. That fight was never winnable, and trying it only ever ends in more turbulence, not less. The real work happens on the ground, in complete calm, rehearsing a new sequence detailed enough to survive contact with the exact trigger that used to defeat you. You know the alarms will sound the instant that new sequence starts winning, and that the alarms were never proof you'd made a mistake. They were proof the old system finally understood it was losing. You know the tower will sometimes push back, confused by a version of you it hasn't updated its records for yet, and that their confusion was never yours to prevent. And you know that control, on its own, was never actually the destination. It was only ever the aircraft capable of reaching one. You've already done something tonight most people never do in years of trying. You named the sequence. You located the exact trigger. You pulled real footage from your own history instead of rehearsing a hopeful guess. And somewhere in the last few minutes, you named a coordinate specific enough that missing it would actually mean something. That alone puts you somewhere most people never reach. Not because they lack the capacity, but because almost nobody stops long enough to actually check the instrument panel and ask who's really been sitting in the seat. The turbulence you're picturing right now, the specific resistance waiting for you the next time an old trigger fires, isn't a sign this won't work. It's simply weather. Real, uncomfortable, and entirely survivable by someone who's already rehearsed exactly what to do when it hits. You are not the same passenger who sat down at the start of this video, quietly assuming the hands on the controls were always yours. You've seen the switch happen. You know how to reach for it now. There was never going to be a perfect, turbulence-free window to begin this. There was only ever going to be tonight or another night indistinguishable from it, further down a route that gets harder to leave the longer it runs uncontested. The engine doesn't care which night you choose. It only cares whether you choose one at all. You already know your coordinate. You named it a few minutes ago, maybe for the first time in years, maybe for the first time ever, in those exact words. Everything else in this video was simply explaining why that coordinate finally has something built specifically to get you there. Take the controls tonight. Not perfectly, not without the old system trying, one more time, to remind you it's still in there. Just decisively enough to leave the ground. Follow the channel if you're ready to keep flying past tonight. And share this with 5 people who are still sitting in the passenger seat, quietly believing the hands on the controls have always been their own.